Hello and welcome back to the Fearless Podcast, where we empower Iowa women to succeed in work and life. As you know, Fearless is a place where we have bold conversations for bold women. I'm LaDrina Wilson, and this month we're diving into a topic that I've been very eager to discuss. It actually makes most people a little bit uncomfortable, but it's absolutely an essential conversation for our growth and empowerment. We're going to be talking about negotiations. Today's episode is entitled Nasty or Nice: When and How Women Negotiate Salaries and much more. And let's be honest, often when women negotiate, we're labeled. We can be defined, when we're being direct, sometimes we're called too aggressive. If we're being collaborative, sometimes we're referred to as too soft. And so how do you negotiate and navigate these tensions of trying to show up in the right way? And that's really what today's conversation is about. And more importantly, how do we refuse to let ourselves be silenced because we just don't know how to show up? I'm really excited to explore everyday negotiation practices that we can use to build into our personal lives, but certainly be prepared for those big moments in our professional lives, like salary conversations, promotion, or even negotiating contracts or opportunities that you see for yourself. Because negotiations aren't exclusive to like a boardroom skill set. It really is a life skill. We'll also be doing a deeper dive into kind of exploring some of the gender dynamics that shape negotiations. So sometimes it's based on, typical practices that you see employers or employees abide by. And then sometimes it's just perceptions and things that we've learned and maybe things we need to unlearn to help us be better in professional settings and making sure that we're equipped to challenge certain narratives and biases that exist. We're going to wrestle with some big questions today about how do we shift the perceptions that women who negotiate are difficult instead of being decisive. Should we also be considering things like, is it even necessary to negotiate in a workplace? Should we just have stronger policies in place that ensure equity and fairness for everyone? So I am thrilled to welcome our guest for today, Cristy Tackett-Hunt. She's going to help us unpack some of these questions and give us her perspective to help us be a little bit less fearless. Cristy Tackett-Hunt serves as General Counsel for Perfusion Solutions Inc, a national provider of specialized perfusion services supporting cardiac surgery, organ donation, and transplant care. Cristy leads legal strategy, supports PSI's rapid growth with responsibility spanning from governance, compliance, risk management, and much more. She is a partner with the executive leadership team in their strategic initiatives, and she focuses on strengthening the organization and driving long-term enterprise value. She also serves as of counsel for Shuttleworth and Ingersoll, and where Cristy also maintains a limited practice focused on transitioning longstanding client relationships and advising firm colleagues on estate planning, trust and probate administration, as well as business law. I'm thrilled to welcome today's guest, Cristy, and she's going to help us unpack so much. Thanks for joining us today, Cristy.
Well, thanks for having me, LaDrina. I'm really happy to be here.
So I know that probably many people are listening and they're like, well, she's an attorney. She's trained at the skill of argument. So can you talk to us a little bit about whether or not you feel like negotiations is something that comes easily for you, given your profession and your background? And if so, why or why not?
So, I know that attorneys are known for being argumentative, but I like to think about it more in the context of advocacy. And I think, if you think arguments, the term argue has a couple of definitions. One, has a nasty component. The other is just gathering information and putting together a persuasive statement of facts and points of view that will help persuade somebody to see things the same way you do. So if you think about it from less of an argumentative perspective and more from an advocacy perspective, I think it will help us sort of settle down. So it will eliminate one of those things that I think prevents women in particular from feeling comfortable with negotiations, which is they're going to be seen negatively. When we think about arguing, a lot of times we think about, someone's being unreasonable, and negotiating absolutely is not unreasonable. It is the most reasonable thing to do, in my opinion. And so I think one of the things that we can start thinking about is just how do we put together the facts that we need to persuade someone to see things the same way that we do. And that is, when we're talking about negotiating salary, what our value is, what our worth is. And so, it does require you to do some research and to understand. One of the things that can sabotage a good negotiation is unreasonable expectations or facts that aren't really facts.
So fiction.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
As I was thinking about this conversation and some of the things that I've experienced professionally, I've watched women actually struggle with this in real time. And I've also seen with some women who do it masterfully. Like they're just really good at it. I think of that old kind of adage, sugar and spice and everything nice. That's what girls are made of, right? In these moments where we're taught to kind of just be nice and don't rock the boat and that type of thing. So why do you think women struggle with negotiations?
Well, I think there's a couple of reasons. And if you think about this for yourself, it's a bit of a personal question, right? So I think everybody struggles a bit with negotiations because there is something inherently, there's a difference of power when you're asking someone for something, right? They can say yes or no, and you're making the ask. So out of the box, it's sort of a power imbalance, at least perceived, because the person making the ask may have all of the power, and they may realize it or they may not. So, one of the things that it makes it uncomfortable is that we're asking for something and somebody else has the power to say yes or no. But again, if you go back to advocacy, you're going to be taking a position that this is what your value is. One of the things that I think people do, women in particular, is they worry about a couple of things. One is backlash. So if I ask for things, how am I going to be perceived and how are people going to react to that? So what's the consequence going to be? And it often feels like it's going to be not a good thing, right? They're going to think I am demanding. They're going to think that I think too highly of myself. And, in some cases that is the actuality, because women have been, I think, conditioned. I'm certainly no expert on this except through my own personal experience, but I think there's conditioning that we should be nice. I mean, you mentioned at the beginning of this, sugar and spice and everything nice. I can honestly say I haven't been accused of that in a long time.
You've not been accused of being nice recently?
Not sugar and spice and everything nice. But I would say, that is something that we have to keep in check, right? Nice is a good thing to be in the right context, but I think you want to be serious in a salary negotiation. And I think that you need to be, whether you actually feel confidence or not, I think you need to work on presenting a confident front, so that you can be perceived as somebody who is worthy of what they're asking for, but also gives just exudes that confidence that makes people want to increase the value of the dollar amount that they place on your skills.
Yeah, I could definitely see that.
Yeah. I think another thing, just so I don't forget, another thing that I think can undermine negotiation for, let's say we're shooting for the moon with the salary request. And I think one of the things that we do is we start to negotiate with ourselves and we think about scarcity, and there's only so many resources. And if I ask for this, what does that do, to the overall budget? What does that do to my coworkers? And I would just say, really try to take that out of your mind and off the table. Not that it's not your problem, but I think if the other person who you're negotiating with, has any skill at all, they're not going to blow their budget so that they can't, so that everyone else is going to suffer because of your request. So I think that's another thing that we don't often think about is that concern that there's not going to be enough for everybody else.
Yeah, yeah. So, do you think based on some of your experiences, are employers just like right out of the gate saying like, here's the top dollar, the top dollar that I'm willing to offer as a first point when they're, offering a salary?
No, no, I don't think so at all. I mean, I think, you know, depending on depending on the environment, some employers may have a salary that they hope for, and that's about it, right? Like they may say, okay, you're worth, I don't know if it's an hourly or an annual figure, but this is what feels most comfortable in my budgets. This is where I'm going to start, or somewhere below that, knowing that there will be, assuming that there will be a negotiation process so they can get to the point that they want. Some places have job bands, with dollars, sort of a continuum of X to Y. And in those cases, sometimes you'll know what they are, sometimes you won't. So, for example, in the government, you know what the rank or the grade of that job is, and then you get a sense of what the dollars will be. And everybody's always looking at, where do you want to be on that continuum? You don't want to be too high because then you don't have any room to grow. But I think you can always push against those in the context of, governmental pay grades. I don't know that there's anything one person can do to sort of push that boundary out, but you certainly can look at, ability to promote to the next pay grade. I don't know if that answered your question, but
No, it does. I mean, it's a little specific to government, but I do think it lends itself to another question that I was kind of curious about. So salary is one aspect of compensation, right? So there are other strategies or creative compensation methods that I feel like I wish more women were aware of when you're considering how to negotiate your worth. So when you think about creative strategies around compensation or other compensation models, what are some things that come to mind that are like resources that women can have in their toolkit when they are negotiating?
right. So, I mean, I love this question because I really think of compensation as a portfolio. And so, I've seen, through my years of experience, I've seen some companies do a great job of presenting, sort of here's your full portfolio of benefits and salary, and this is the total value, and it makes you feel better or worse about the position that you're in, depending on what those numbers look like. But I think, we often only think about, especially when we're new in negotiations, we only think about that salary. And we don't think about all of the fringe benefits. How much paid time off am I going to get? And, it's really a great thing now, to think about unlimited PTO. Well, I would suggest to you, that maybe that says that you're going to be so darn busy that taking a day off is going to be, hard to recover from. And so they don't ever have anybody take too much time off. So that's why they're thinking about that. So keep that in mind. But if you're getting a specific amount of paid time off, that's a space where you might be able to ask for more time so that you can do the other things that you love to do. There is bonuses, so I don't know how companies across the board structure bonuses or not. But if there is an opportunity for bonuses annually, that's great. I think when I'm coming into a job, the first thing I would think about is a sign-on bonus. So a sign-on is immediately money in your pocket. You're probably going to have some responsibility to stay with the employer for some period of time, but that's a way to increase immediately your overall comp. Now, employers like that because it's a one-time cost and they don't have to necessarily pay you again and again and again. But if you want them to do that, there is something called a retention bonus, right? So if there's a way that you can say, okay, I'm willing to come on board, especially if they indicate that they have some limitations around their ability to meet your salary request. You can talk about retention bonus. So if you're then, if you stick around and you continue to serve that employer, then they can bonus you at that time. Sometimes those look a lot like a sign-on bonus, a fixed dollar amount, and you get them just for still being there a year from now, or 2 years from now, or 3 years from now, depending on how many years you can negotiate that retention. Did you have a question?
No, that was actually one that hadn't occurred to me. So
Mm-hmm.
that was what you were seeing on my face.
Uh-huh.
Are there other like what what would you say about like different types of deferred compensation plans?
So I think deferred comp is interesting, but I think, that's probably going to come later in career, right? I wouldn't expect a new, a first time job seeker to get that, but people who are later in their career can talk through deferred comp options. There are certainly stock options and RSUs, and there's all kinds of different structures around that can divert, compensation today into a space where you get it later, which is, if you're a tax wonk, then that's also an exciting thing. But it kicks the can down the road. Employers sometimes like it because they don't have to fund it immediately. Often they're doing it, or they don't have to fund it with cash immediately. And so it gives them an opportunity to get better talent for less dollars up front.
Right, right. Well, and I do think that there are women at all stages of their career that are trying to figure out, it's not just about how you enter the organization. It's also I've been in this situation where this job looks a lot different than what was on the paper for the job descriptions. Like the other duties as assigned very much expanded, in the time period I was there. So I think just having these different tools at different phases in your career is really important.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that, often people find themselves in a bit of a quandary or quagmire is when they accepted a job under a certain set of expectations and they get there and it's completely different than what they expected in terms of, commitment or engagement or, just it's significantly more. And so, in those situations, I think that's a good time to go back to the table and start talking about, what you're contributing and what its value is.
So from your perspective, how does that you said research earlier, right? So I feel like that's obviously one tactic that you're going to use even if you're already in a position. What what does that look like? How do you suggest someone initiates a conversation like that?
Well, if it's me, as just directly, right? Like it's just a matter of, finding or making time to do so. The one thing I think that is always problematic, and it doesn't matter if you're brand new to the workforce or you're a seasoned, veteran and you've been around the block 30 times. But actually getting the attention of the right people is always a challenge. And certainly when people know you're going to make an ask, they might have reasons to avoid. But I think the more direct that you can be in asking for, an allocation of time for that conversation, the better off you're going to be. Because I think looking for an organic opportunity is tricky. And I think you'll wait a long time. But I do think that there's ways to be professional in your request for time. But I do think it takes a little bit of, again, that confidence thing to just make the ask. And sometimes I'm not a big proponent of asking for these things in email, but sometimes if you can't get the person on the phone or you can't get a face to face, shoot them an email and nudge it up until you get, some sort of response. Now, having said that, I've dealt with employees who are excessively demanding and making unreasonable demands and they're asked and answered. And so you want to know where you're crossing a line into, making too many asks. That's not helpful.
Yeah, yeah. So being strategic about not just the research and what information you gather. And I think the research is not just what's happening in the labor market. It's also like, what are my peers getting to? Having some awareness around their compensation packages for comparable work. But I also hear you saying being strategic about how you make your ask. So maybe not trickling in every 3 or 4 months and asking for something different or new, but really a comprehensive conversation and package that says this is what I want.
Yeah. Yes. And I would, first of all, I would never start the negotiation. That's a lawyer trick, right? Like never throw the number out first. So, I mean, a lot of times people will ask you what you think you should make or what your goals are. And I think you can answer that question without getting into specific dollar amounts, you know. and I, it could be something as simple as, well, we know what the market's doing and we know what the market's paying, and I want to be, at market rate. I would refine it a little bit more than that. But I think in talking in sort of less concrete terms will serve you well, especially out of the box. I mean, you're going to have to get concrete at some point, but I don't like to negotiate against myself, right?
So you should go in at least knowing what you want, but approach it in a way that at least leaves space for the employer to tell you where they're willing to start.
Right. Right. Well, and I think too that the thing I've often done is, like I said, I think of comp as a portfolio. So, look at all of the different classes of compensation that you're receiving: PTO, bonuses, sign-on, retention, deferred comp, all of those things, and then think about what, isn't necessarily cash in your pocket immediately, but that has some significant value to you. I can think of a time where I was discussing with a friend. She was worried about negotiating a new position in the comp package, and she was worried about not having the amount of vacation time that she'd become accustomed to. And I said, ask for more. She's like, well, you can't do that. I said, you can do whatever you want. I mean, they can say no, but you can certainly ask for it. Ask them to fill your time bank, give you 10 days to start. And they did. And she was stunned. And it taught her that, once you hear yes one time, it creates a lot of confidence. So, if you haven't had your own yeses, listen to other people and know that it's possible. And it doesn't really, you don't have to be exceptionally skilled. You just have to be organized and, again, confident.
Yeah. Or at least the appearance of confidence.
Yeah. Confidence doesn't really have to live within you. It just has to be on your face on that particular day.
Yeah. Well, Cristy, I have one last question for you.
Okay.
When you look back, over the course of your career in the last 20 plus years, and you think back on times when you've had to negotiate, is there anything that comes to mind where you're like, gosh, I wish I would have known this? Or even if you go back further than that, I wish I would have known this then because I would have done this differently. Like, what's the one thing that you want to leave women with that, like, you wish that someone would have, like, kind of given to you in preparation for some of the types of conversations you've had?
So my first job out of law school, I got an offer by phone. And I had fainted the day before, so I had an injury, right? I had a broken nose. And so they called and they made me the offer, and I'm like, okay, thank you. And that was all I said, because I didn't feel good, right? 20 minutes later, they called back with more money.
Oh, wow.
Because I think they thought I wasn't interested because of my response. So I was like, oh, this is really great, right? Did I negotiate? No. I didn't ask for any more. And now, and when I don't know, 6 months, a year later, I'm like, there was more money on that table. Mm-hmm. I mean, if I didn't do anything and they just perceived that I wasn't that as interested as they should be, and they came back with more money, there was more money on that table that I could have asked for.
Right.
So that's one thing. I think, another thing is really going back to that idea of scarcity. Just, they'll tell you they're not going to bust their budget to get you unless you're, I don't know, Beyonce. Maybe they'd bust their budget for that, but they know what they can afford. And so if you've done your research and you're confident that what you're asking for, and always ask for a stretch, right? Like, because when you walk in that door, everything else you get is going to be based on where you started. Mm-hmm. So everything it multiplies, right? And so you want that foundational piece to be bigger, because then everything that grows from that will also be larger. But make sure that you know what you're talking about, but also reach for the highest part of the shelf when you're asking for that.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much for sharing your lived experience, your perspective. I love the little lawyer trick that you've shared with us too, like make them say it first.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
That's been very helpful. We're going to shift gears now and we're going to bring in our other host, Macey Shofroth, and she is going to be talking with an expert from University of Iowa today to just get another perspective on kind of what needs to happen in negotiations. Thanks so much for your time, Cristy.
Thanks, LaDrina. Great to see you.
Thank you, LaDrina. Today we are joined by Beth Livingston to talk about strategies that she teaches for negotiation at the University of Iowa. Beth is the Ralph L. Sheets Associate Professor in Industrial Relations at the University of Iowa's Tippie College of Business. After receiving her PhD from the University of Florida, she spent 8 years at Cornell University in the School of Industrial and Labor Relations before joining Tippie. Her research has been highlighted in the New York Times, NPR, and the Harvard Business Review, and she's been published in top academic journals. And she is the co-author of Shared Sisterhood with Tina Opie. So Beth, I want to say thank you for being here with us today to talk about negotiation strategies and how we can develop them further. And we are so glad to have your insight share with our audience. And I want to know more kind of about your research and you as a researcher. What have you found to be the barriers that specifically women experience when it comes to negotiating throughout their careers?
I've started my career studying a lot of different gender differences in the workplace, a lot of ways in which women may not necessarily receive the same benefits or the same outputs for their inputs compared to their male counterparts. And negotiation comes up time and time again in the research and in the literature as being an issue that is differentiated between men and women in terms of, particularly in terms of the outcomes that men and women tend to negotiate, and the situations under which they choose to negotiate. This has been a very big interest for me. I've studied how men and women, for instance, negotiate with their partners and these sort of behind the scenes negotiations. So the choices that we make about our careers are often not made in a silo. We're discussing with family members, we're having conversations about what we want out of our lives, and have those conversations with our partners. And those are indeed negotiations. We have things we want, they have things they want, and we have to engage in a give and take to be able to establish those norms and establish those outcomes. And so my research has found that even in those partnership relationships where you think I can say, here's what I really want, here's who I really want to be, we still see that women often fall into what we call gendered norms of negotiation, where they're perhaps a little bit more other concerned or other centered and less self-centered in the way in which they negotiate. But women do end up working towards those things and finding ways to be more self-focused. And in those cases, they often do receive the outputs that they need. But there will often be, or could perhaps be, some relational backlash to that. And so my research has really found that there's a complex interplay.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Have you found some maybe reasons or explanations for where those gender differences come from and why we as women tend to be, like you said, more other-centered rather than self-centered?
That's one of the hardest questions, I think, in all of social psychology and organizational psychology is, were you born with it, or is it kind of the social context? What I will say is, for the solutions we have in the workplace, it really doesn't matter. And what I mean by that is, it doesn't matter if we're born with it or we're socialized into it. The solutions in the workplace need to be the same, which is we need to make sure that we have structures in place that make sure that women feel empowered to ask for things that they deserve, that they know what things are available to them to ask for. Oftentimes, I think we don't know what's negotiable and what's not negotiable. And so there can be an assumption that this isn't negotiable. And to make sure that we are examining the data in our workplaces to see where there might be gendered or sex-based differences that might be resultant by men asking for more, and so they get more. So it's not that they necessarily deserve more, and that can end up in long-term career outcomes and differences between men and women. And so I think the solutions remain the same, which is we look at what sort of things are negotiable, we look at what are the most effective ways to negotiate, and we try to make sure that individual women are empowered to do that and have the skills that they need to do that, and that organizations know when they are enacting backlash against women for asking, and are able to see patterns within their specific workplace of, oh, actually, every guy we hired this year negotiated and got a $5,000 more. No, none of the women, or very few of the women, did. And so now we have this gender pay gap that we didn't intend to have. And so it's, again, making sure those structures are in place.
Interesting. I'm curious about that you mentioned empowering women to know that they're able to negotiate. And I think there is probably systemic ways we can do that, and then personal ways we can also do that to almost like empower ourselves. Like, what are those strategies that more women should try on or enact to empower themselves to be able to feel confident enough to ask for what they want?
So there are some like psychological things, I think, where I think particularly in a place where jobs are scarce, I think so many women right now are like, and people in general are like, I need a job. Want a good job. There can be a sense of, when you're offered a job, a sense of relief, of gratefulness, of oh, thank goodness. And that there can be a fear then that if I ask for more, they're going to take it away from me, or they're going to think I'm ungrateful. And I think so there's a psychological point to be like, you are worthy of this job. It is not a gift. It is something that you have earned, and therefore you can ask for what you believe that you deserve. I think the other thing is empowering people to talk to each other, empowering, making it clear that, you can ask. Well, I think we have a kind of general disdain for talking about what we make. Like, we don't like to talk about our wages. And so we end up operating under misinformation, or we end up operating with less information than we need to make good decisions. And so making sure we have a place where we can share that information, hey, did you know that you're actually, you can ask for these things. And so there's a lot of mentorship, I think, that needs to go on in sharing of that information. I also think that we can look at what the research does find about the differences between men and women that we tend to see in negotiation and try to learn from that. So one of the things, there is backlash that can happen where when women ask for things, they might be seen as not feminine or not grateful. And yes, I think sometimes women don't ask because they know they'll be penalized for doing so, or they fear they will be. And oftentimes we find that men don't experience that same fear in that same way. And so they don't feel they will be backlashed against. And so I think this is not a made up phenomenon in women's heads. It actually is something that has been experienced before. And so one of the solutions that some women have come up with, and that we find in the research that works, is asking on behalf of other people. And so being able to put a coalition together and say, okay, well, I'll ask for you, I'll advocate for you, you advocate for me. And people, there doesn't tend to be backlash against women when they ask on behalf of other people, because women stereotypically are seen as the communal caregiving side. And so when you're asking on behalf of other people, it's seen as the thing that women would do. And so I often talk to managers and I'm like, advocate for your employees for raises for them, right? So they're not asking directly, they are, being advocated for, and then they're more likely to get those things. And so finding those networks of communities in your workplace where you can advocate for one another and be side by side with each other can be helpful in the sort of collective gain where everyone tends to do better.
When you said that reminded me of that thing I think a lot of little girls do, where they say, if you ask my mom, she'll say yes to you, so can you go do that? That's cute. I like how that sisterhood.
We've learned it at a very young age, right?
That's funny. I love that. What are some of the negotiation practices that maybe we can start to use in our everyday life in order to feel ready for those times where we come up to that big negotiation, where it's something that feels more high stakes?
So there's a couple of things that I advocate you do that seem very basic and straightforward, but I think if you look within yourself, you probably will see that you don't do this as much as you should. And I think the first thing is know what's negotiable in your workplace. Know there are so many components of a contract. There's salary, there's bonuses, there's days off, there's benefits, there's flex time, there's all of these different components, there's vacation of your job that may or may not be negotiable. And oftentimes many of those things are. And we don't often think about the multiple components of our compensation and benefits packages, and other conditions of employment around the way we work. Can you negotiate for flex time? Can you negotiate for different projects, for different types of travel? And so really think about what about this job could change that would make you more productive, more happier, more fulfilled, and better positioned to reach your goals. And think about how you would craft that job in a way you want and really write those things down and say, here's, if I could have one day a week where I could work off site, that would I wouldn't have to commute. That would help my life, whatever those things are. Okay, well, let's start to think about whether that's negotiable or not. And I think a lot of times we don't sit down and do that self-work. So that's the first thing that I would say.
I'm curious, how can managers and businesses tell their employees what is negotiable? And is there a benefit on the company side to doing that and making that known?
So I think oftentimes you see companies, and this is really the nature of negotiation, is with many negotiations, you can feel that we call it a distributive negotiation, which means there's a winner and a loser. It can feel like, well, if you get more money, we as a company get less, right? There's this idea of this is a zero sum negotiation. When we teach it, that's what we call it, right? As like, this is a type of negotiation where if one person wins, somebody else loses. And I think we, in America in particularly, we're very familiar with those types of negotiations, right? We're like, okay, if I get what I want, you lose. And there can almost be a sense of competition and winning to it that can like solve different sorts of problems. And I think companies, when you think of the word negotiation, often think of negotiations that way, and because they're often thinking of salary negotiations. And I like to try to say, your employees are assets, are investments, are components of what makes your company work. And if we can shift this around to a more collaborative experience, where instead of we're sitting across the table and I know you want something and I don't want to give it to you, and we're gonna debate about that and negotiate that, how can we be on the same page and solve a problem? So can we shift this around? There's this external problem that we are both working to solve, as opposed to I have something you want, you have something I want, let's negotiate. And I think that's a mental shift, but it really does affect how creative we are in our problem solving. And so I like to say, okay, what problem are we actually trying to solve here? Do you feel, is it that you can't afford things? Well, then you definitely probably need more money. Is it that you don't feel valued? What other ways can you feel valued? Is it that, right, like you as a manager don't believe people are being as creative or innovative or productive? What is the problem you're trying to solve with this negotiation? And let's be creative about solving.
I like that idea of coming to the table with that problem identified. And I also think there is a lot of times that women self-impose this kind of feeling that I'm being too demanding, and I like the idea of switching that around to how can we collaborate together? And in that vein of kind of perception about women, some of that maybe is self-imposed, but a lot of that gender bias is real, coming from the other side, where they might actually see us as being too demanding, or the person requesting something more as being too demanding. How can we change that perception of those women who negotiate as coming across too aggressive? How do we shift that from the person receiving the request?
Well, that's a really long-term societal problem that, boy, do I wish I could solve. I'd be a very popular lady if I could solve that problem, but because it is a deep one, right? And I think I like to think in my life about the fact that there are multiple layers of problems. So I like to think of levels. There's the sort of within ourselves, within our psychology, how do we change our mindset of how we think about ourselves and what's negotiable? And that's true for you as an individual employee and for managers. How do you shift your mindset? How do you challenge yourself and be aware if you're getting that tense feeling when she asks for something? Okay. Remember, I care about her. I want her to succeed. So what is really going on here? And I'm going to ask good questions to get at what's really bothering you, right? I'm not going to assume you're demanding because you want to be demanding. I'm going to put we like to call it the most generous intent on this. What's the most generous interpretation of this behavior that I can give this person, right? They're not negotiating because they're demanding. They're negotiating because they're feeling unvalued or whatever these sorts of things are, right? So that's the first thing, is what's internal to us. And then I look at the organizational level. Sometimes it's good to say, like I've seen more companies move towards entry-level positions are non-negotiable. Nothing in this is negotiable. We've taken away any individual variance in negotiation because we do not allow negotiation. So it's a take it or leave it for all entry-level employees, with the idea is that everybody comes in on the same footing. There's no way, there's no leeway in this. This can be a useful tool for you as an organization if you have more good applicants than you can choose from, right? It can help you be like, no, there's not one person I'm going for. There's lots of people who can be great for me. So I think there's kind of multiple levels here. And then there's the societal level, which is definitely way above my pay grade.
Yeah, I'm sure all of us wish we could fix just at the snap of our fingers. I'm curious. So I am getting to the point where I guess I can't really call myself new to my career anymore. But I know at the beginning of careers, especially for young women, like negotiating just seems like we have no power. Like we're that entry level person. How dare we ask for more? I wonder how you would advise, especially being somebody who works at a university, I assume interacts probably with younger people. How did you advise people at the beginning of their careers to kind of get into that mindset of being able to negotiate and get what they need?
I think it's an interesting dynamic, and I have 700 undergrads right now, all probably within the ages, most of them within the ages of 18 to 21, right? I interact with them all the time, and they're phenomenal. Like, our kids are okay. Like, they are smart, and they are capable, and they're funny, and they're interesting, but sometimes they don't have the confidence in that I think that they should. And there is definitely a difference in having too much confidence that prevents you from learning and growing, and having not enough confidence that doesn't allow you to take advantage of the opportunities that come to you. And so I talk a lot to young people about striking that balance. Know yourself. Know what your strengths are. And I think we've done young people a disservice where we've made this, what are your strengths, into some like interview question where you have to make yourself look as good as possible, as opposed to a real like developmental exercise that we engage in on a regular basis. Say, what am I good at? What do I need to improve on? And how can I, as a young woman in particular, because I think what we do see is women often have lower self-esteem about those things and lower self-efficacy about those things, even if they have the same capabilities, is to be able to say, you look at all the things you can do. And what we see oftentimes is young men say, my weaknesses don't matter, I'm going to capitalize on my strengths. And young women often say, my weaknesses are not good enough for this. And they ignore their strengths. And I try to flip that on its head and say, this is all who you are, and all of this matters, but you need to know your worth. And I don't say that as some like big woo-woo moment, but truly, if you want to be in the workplace, know what you're good at. Capitalize on those strengths while always being personally aware of your weaknesses.
Yeah, I love that. And I like the idea of kind of checking in with yourself regularly to keep that.
Because your strengths and weaknesses change. You're talking about not being new to your career. Congratulations. Because what a great new sense of self-awareness you have of, here's what I have done really, really well. And here's the ways I would like to continue to grow. And that self-awareness provides opportunities for new negotiation. Because you can say, you know what? I want you to send me back for a certificate program because I'm really good at this. And I could be good at that. Or, you know what? I think you should give me leadership over this new project, and here's why. And so those same skills that help us negotiate also help us advocate to get those new career stretch goals that we want.
I love that. And when we started this conversation, we were using the word not arguing, but advocating. So I love that. Yeah. That's the word that you chose there.
Well, and it's very funny because that happens when I talk to couples. Is I'll be like, "Oh, you're negotiating." They're like, "We're not arguing." I'm like, "No, I didn't say you were arguing." But yeah, it's we're having a discussion. Okay.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, Beth, I want to say thank you again for joining us. Your insight and your information from your research is really helpful, and I think a lot of people, not even just women, but people are going to get some really good information from this conversation. So with that, I'm going to send it back to LaDrina, and she's going to get us all wrapped up.
Thank you, ladies. That was a delightful conversation and definitely pulled some nuggets from that portion of our time together. A couple of things that stand out to me that I hope our listeners can take with them is really looking at shifting the paradigm around negotiations. Negotiations doesn't equal arguing. Negotiations equals advocacy. Another thing that stood out to me very loud and clear is not just knowing your worth, but also doing your research so that as you present your worth, you are doing it in a logical and reasoned fashion. Knowing what's negotiable, right? We talked about some of the various things that people do negotiate as they're entering a job, but certainly also while you're on the job, recognizing where there's those spaces for you to advocate for yourself for more responsibility, more money, more time, whatever is of value to you. And then on the organizational side, really organizations need to have some accountability around the recognition of disparities that come from the lack of negotiations that sometimes women engage in. So keeping a pulse on where there are income disparities based on gender simply because negotiations haven't taken place, and then actually doing the work to rectify those. So I really hope that listeners today are equipped for whatever their next phase is in negotiations, for wherever you're at in your profession. But most importantly, and as always, I want you to go forward and be bold, be brilliant, and be fearless.